Imagine, for a moment, that the year is 1350. The great forests of Europe stand heavy with snow, their branches bent beneath the weight of winter. The rivers have frozen into silence, the fields lie bare and lifeless, and the nights stretch on for hours that feel like days. You are not a knight or a noble, wrapped in furs before a roaring hearth. You are a peasant, a villager whose survival depends not on riches, but on ingenuity, endurance, and hope. The cold presses in from every side, and yet life must go on. Families must eat, animals must be tended, and somehow, the body must be kept alive until spring returns. In this story, we will wander into the frost-covered cottages of medieval peasants, slip beneath their woolen blankets, and learn the secrets they use to endure the coldest nights of the year. From strange sleeping habits and shared beds, to fear of the endless dark and the quiet rituals that kept despair at bay. This is the world of ordinary people, living through extraordinary hardship. So settle in, let your mind drift, and together, we will journey back into a winter that yourself stepping out of a peasant's cottage in the depths of a medieval January, somewhere in the countryside of England, France, or perhaps deep in the Germanic lands. The morning air bites with a sharpness that feels almost unnatural, a freezing wind that cuts straight through woolen tunics and ragged cloaks. The land before you is silent, covered in a heavy blanket of snow that muffles every sound. In the Middle Ages, winters were not only long, but often brutally cold, especially during what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period when temperatures across Europe dropped noticeably lower than they are today. For medieval peasants, these were not picturesque, snowy landscapes admired through the safety of a window, but instead a direct threat to survival. The cold crept into their bones, into their homes, and into every aspect of daily life. Nights were particularly cruel when the sun slipped away early and the world was swallowed by a darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Without electricity, without central heating, without even the knowledge of what caused these fluctuations in climate, peasants faced the coldest nights with little more than determination, tradition, and a handful of clever survival strategies passed down through generations. But before those strategies could be employed, the sheer weight of winter itself had to be endured, a season that tested the limits of human resilience. The arrival of winter was often anticipated with dread. Unlike in the modern world, where we prepare for winter with heavy coats, insulated homes, and stocked pantries, peasants of the Middle Ages faced the season with far fewer resources. By late autumn, the harvest was complete, and granaries or small storage pits held whatever grains, beans, and root vegetables could be saved. Meat, unless salted, smoked, or pickled, was difficult to preserve, and fresh food became scarce. This scarcity was magnified when snow covered the fields and roads, making it impossible to gather wild herbs or hunt effectively. Hunger often accompanied the cold, and the body, already weakened by poor nutrition, struggled to withstand freezing temperatures. The biting wind would seep through the cracks of wattle and daub walls, and smoke from poorly vented hearths filled cottages with choking haze as families desperately tried to trap any trace of warmth. The long nights meant more hours in the dark, more time spent shivering beneath thin woolen blankets, and more moments when a person's mind turned to the uncertainty of survival. It was not uncommon for infants, the elderly, or the sick to succumb to cold-related illnesses, their lives slipping away quietly in the night. The harshness of these winters shaped not only peasant endurance, but also their worldview, a constant reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of medieval nights were often described in chronicles as unnatural stillness, where the air seemed so sharp that it froze not just water, but sound itself. Villages would grow eerily quiet, not because life had ceased, but because everyone huddled indoors, conserving what little heat they could. The snow muffled footsteps, and smoke curled sluggishly from chimneys, thick and heavy in the icy atmosphere. Inside a peasant's hut, the fire, if fuel was available, smoldered weakly in the hearth. Wood was precious and often scarce, so fires were not allowed to roar as they might in the halls of nobility. Instead, small embers glowed, and the family gathered tightly together around them. Sometimes, the fire was kept low intentionally, just enough to survive the night, so that the woodpile would last the season. The sound of crackling wood was accompanied by the faint breathing of family members, bundled in cloaks, tunics, or whatever scraps of cloth could be spared. Even so, the cold was relentless. It seeped up through the earthen floors, settled on the walls, and clung to every breath. In such conditions, sleep was less an escape and more a fragile truce with the elements. The line between comfort and suffering was thin, and every night carried the haunting possibility that someone might not wake. Winter was not simply a time of cold, but also a season of fear and uncertainty. The coldest nights brought with them not just physical discomfort, but also an emotional heaviness, a kind of winter despair. Imagine lying awake on a straw-stuffed mattress, the thin blanket pulled up to your chin, while the wind howls through cracks in the roof. Outside, the village dogs bark faintly in the distance, warning of unseen dangers in the night. Wolves, perhaps, emboldened by hunger, or thieves who used the cover of winter to prowl for easy prey. Darkness lasted far longer than the daylight, sometimes stretching for 15 or 16 hours, depending on the latitude. With no candles for most peasants, only rushlights or small oil lamps at best, the hours after sunset were consumed in shadow. Families would speak in whispers or murmur prayers to saints, asking for protection against the cold and the spirits they believed roamed more freely in the winter night. In such darkness, with the world beyond the walls both invisible and inhospitable, imagination often painted frightening pictures. Some believed frost itself had spirits, malicious entities that crept inside to steal warmth from the living. Superstition and survival blended together, reinforcing the sense that these were not ordinary nights, but nights filled with mystery, danger, and a relentless chill that pressed against the thin boundary between life. The impact of these winters on medieval society cannot be overstated. Cold weather shaped not only the daily routines of peasants, but also broader cultural and religious practices. Winter saints, such as Saint Nicholas or Saint Martin, were often invoked during this season, their feast days tied to hopes of protection and relief. In some villages, communal gatherings were arranged to share warmth and food, a reminder that survival was rarely a solitary effort, but a collective one. Yet, even in community, there remained a sobering awareness of mortality. Graves often filled faster during the coldest months, as disease and frost claimed the vulnerable. Chroniclers of the time wrote of entire villages decimated by successive harsh winters, with weakened bodies unable to endure famine and frost together. For the survivors, the memory of those losses lingered. Every winter night was lived with a kind of quiet reverence, an acknowledgement that life was fragile and tomorrow was never guaranteed. Unlike in the modern world, where winter is softened by technology, in the medieval countryside, the season was an annual trial by nature, a test that peasants endured again and again, generation after generation. These experiences carved resilience into their culture, but also a deep respect, even fear, for the relentless power. Despite these hardships, peasants endured. The very fact that communities persisted, that families raised children, and that villages survived through centuries of bitter winters is itself a testament to human adaptability. Survival did not come easily, and many succumbed, but the ones who lived carried forward traditions, methods, and stories that sustained their descendants. When we imagine those long, cold nights, it is easy to picture only suffering, and there was plenty of it. But there was also resilience, and even moments of comfort. Families drew closer, not just physically but emotionally, bound together by necessity. Storytelling, songs, and prayers filled the hours of darkness. Simple gestures, like sharing the last ember of warmth or placing a child closer to the family dog for heat, spoke of love and perseverance. For the medieval peasant, winter was both enemy and teacher. It demanded resourcefulness, unity, and humility in the face of forces beyond control. These nights may seem unbearably bleak to us, softened as we are by modern luxuries. But for those who lived them, they were part of the rhythm of existence. Each winter survived was a small victory, and each cold night endured was a quiet triumph against nature's most unyielding home of a medieval peasant. It is tempting to imagine something sturdy and cozy, perhaps a small version of a noble's manor, but the truth was far different. Most peasants lived in simple cottages made of wattle and daub, woven wooden frames plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. These walls were effective enough to keep out the rain, but when it came to the bitter bite of winter, they provided little insulation. The roof was typically thatched, a thick layering of straw tied together in bundles, and though it repelled water fairly well, it did not stop the icy wind from seeping in through cracks. Floors were earthen, packed down hard by countless footsteps, and in the coldest months, that earth turned damp and chilled. radiating a coldness that crept upward into the body of anyone lying upon it. Yet this was home for millions of peasants across medieval Europe. Humble, drafty, smoke-filled, and fragile against the long winters. In these cottages, survival depended on a family's ingenuity. The structure itself was not built to withstand the harshest nights, so it was the customs, tricks, and communal strategies within those walls that transformed a thin barrier of mud and straw into a shelter that could, against the odds, keep life safe through the cottages. Warmth revolved around the hearth. For most peasants, there was only one source of heat: an open fire pit in the center of the single-room dwelling, or, in slightly larger homes, a crude fireplace set against one wall. These fires served multiple purposes: cooking, light, and of course, heat, but the efficiency was poor. Much of the warmth disappeared upward through a smoke hole or cracks in the roof. And without chimneys in many earlier cottages, smoke filled the room, stinging eyes and clinging to hair and clothes. Despite this, the hearth was the heart of the home. Families would crowd near it, arranging themselves in layers, with elders and children placed closest to the flames. To make fuel last longer, the fire was often reduced to glowing embers at night, carefully banked with ash to keep it smoldering until dawn. During the coldest stretches of winter, the faint glow of those embers was sometimes the only thing standing between life and frostbite. Wood, after all, was a luxury. In many villages, peasants were forbidden to cut timber from the Lord's forests, relying instead on gathering fallen branches, dried reeds, or even burning dried animal dung when nothing else was available. Each stick of wood was measured in terms of survival, and so the hearth became both a comfort and a constant worry. How to make the warmth last just a little longer until spring returned. Peasants relied on creative methods to trap what little heat they could inside their cottages. One of the most common was the use of rushes or straw, spread thick across the floor. While modern eyes might see this as primitive, the layer of straw acted as a crude but effective form of insulation, blocking some of the damp chill that seeped upward from the earth. Rushes were not only scattered loosely, but sometimes woven into mats that could be replaced when they became too filthy or moldy. In wealthier homes, fresh herbs like lavender, mint, or meadowsweet might be mixed in, masking odors and even repelling pests. In peasant homes, though, the straw floor was simply a necessity. It held warmth and gave a little padding for bare feet in the night. Walls, too, were sometimes improved with plaster or hung with cloth, animal skins, or even sacks stuffed with straw to cover drafty holes. These methods were far from perfect, but every small adjustment could mean the difference between shivering through the night and sleeping intolerable, if still chilly, comfort. In winter, families became masters of patchwork solutions, layering their homes with whatever natural materials were at hand to make their fragile walls stand against the peasants used to endure the coldest nights with strategic sleeping arrangements. Rather than spread out, families and sometimes extended kin would huddle together, clustering as tightly as possible on straw mattresses or benches pushed close to the fire. The idea was simple: conserve body heat by sharing it. Children often slept sandwiched between parents or older siblings, their small bodies shielded from the cold by the warmth of others. In some regions, wooden bedsteads or sleeping platforms were raised slightly above the ground to avoid the worst of the damp. These were sometimes enclosed with curtains, not for luxury, but for practicality. The curtains created a small pocket of trapped heat. In villages where people lived communally, it was not unusual for multiple families to share space on the coldest nights, blurring the line between private and communal life. What might seem uncomfortable to us was, for them, simply survival. Shared breath, shared blankets, and shared space meant a fighting chance against the winter. Even their animals, as we will explore more deeply later, were often brought inside, further adding to the warmth. In this way, the peasant home was less an individual dwelling and more a living organism, where every person, every animal, and every ember of the hearth played a role in keeping the warmth that peasants sought within their homes during winter, but also protection from the dangers that the cold encouraged. Harsh weather made travel difficult, isolating villages and leaving homes vulnerable. Wolves, driven closer by hunger, occasionally prowled near settlements, their howls carried on the frozen wind. Thieves and outlaws, too, might exploit the cover of night, slipping into barns or cottages in search of food or fuel. Thus, the peasant cottage was fortified in its own modest way during winter. Doors, often little more than wooden planks, were barred with heavy beams, and shutters were drawn tightly across small windows. Cracks in the walls were stuffed with cloth or straw, not just to keep out the cold, but also to keep out the sense of exposure to whatever lurked beyond the darkness. The home became a fortress, albeit a fragile one, where safety was as psychological as it was physical. Within these walls, families told stories, murmured prayers, and sang simple songs, each ritual reinforcing the feeling that the thin shelter they had built could withstand the long night. In this way, the cottage was more than just a building. It was a cocoon of human resilience, crafted from mud, wood, and the shared determination drafty by modern standards. The peasant's home was a place of innovation. Every winter tested the limits of these structures, and every winter forced peasants to adapt in new ways. Some stuffed old clothing into gaps around the roof. Others spread damp hides across walls to block the wind, and many simply relied on their own bodies pressed close together for warmth. What strikes us today is not the inadequacy of these cottages, but the remarkable fact that they worked. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but just enough. They were survival machines, shaped as much by necessity as by architecture. To step into one on a medieval winter night would be to enter a smoky, dim, crowded world, where the smell of burning would mingled with straw, animal musk, and the earthy scent of damp walls. It would feel cramped, yet alive with the quiet persistence of those who refused to yield to the cold. For the medieval peasant, these homes were never luxurious, but they were lifelines. Within their thin walls, families survived night after night, season after season, and in doing so, They left us a story of endurance that whispers through history. In the simplest of shelters, the coldest of nights could be met not with despair, but with resourcefulness in the stubbornness of the medieval world. When even the embers of the hearth struggled to glow against the chill, peasants turned to one of the simplest and most effective survival strategies imaginable. They slept alongside their animals. Today, the thought might seem uncomfortable, even unthinkable, but in a time before central heating, insulated homes, or electric blankets, animals were living radiators, sources of warmth that could mean the difference between life and death. A cow, after all, gives off nearly as much heat as a small fire. A few sheep pressed against a cottage wall radiated a gentle warmth into the room. Chickens nestled on perches above straw floors not only provided eggs, but contributed to the living body heat that filled a peasant's home. Far from being a strange or rare practice, the presence of animals inside cottages during winter was widespread across Europe. It was not just practical, but deeply woven into the rhythm of rural life. To modern ears, it might sound unsanitary, but for medieval peasants, it was survival, a forgotten heating system created not by invention, but by necessity, and one that turned their small, smoky homes into living ecosystems where man and beast endured, often built with this coexistence in mind. The typical one-room cottage might have a slightly raised area for the family to sleep, while the lower portion of the floor was reserved for animals, cows, sheep, goats, and sometimes even pigs. This design allowed body heat from the animals to rise naturally toward the sleeping humans, creating a shared warmth that helped insulate the space. In some cases, animals were kept in adjoining pens or small lean-tos attached to the cottage, but in the coldest months, they were often brought directly inside. The sounds of snorting oxen, bleating goats, and rustling chickens became part of the nightly atmosphere, blending with the crackle of the hearth and the whispered prayers of the family. To the medieval peasant, this was not unpleasant but familiar, even comforting. The animals were not just laborers or food sources. They were companions in hardship, their warmth as valuable as their milk or wool. The cottage became a shared sanctuary where the needs of man and beast intertwined, and where survival was a collective effort. In this way, medieval peasants practiced a form of sustainable living that blurred the line between human dwelling and barn, a practice born not from ignorance, but from an intimate understanding. Animals was more than just a convenience. It was a safeguard against one of winter's deadliest threats, exposure during sleep. For many peasants, waking in the middle of the night to find frost creeping along the edges of their blanket was a terrifyingly common experience. The body, weakened by hunger or illness, could easily succumb to hypothermia in such conditions. Animals helped counter this risk. A cow lying nearby radiated enough heat to keep the chill from settling too heavily over the room. Sheep huddled close provided warmth that lingered long into the night, their thick wool trapping heat like natural insulation. Even small animals played their part. Chickens, roosting above or sometimes even sharing bedding, added a subtle but noticeable warmth, while dogs curled at the feet of their owners created little islands of heat beneath the covers. These arrangements were not accidental but intentional, a carefully orchestrated balance where every living creature had its place. To fall asleep surrounded by animals was not considered degrading but sensible, a recognition that survival depended on cooperation with the creatures that shared the land. In this way, the medieval peasant's night was a lesson in humility, where warmth came not from wealth or luxury, but from an ancient bond between humans. This practice came with its own set of challenges. Living and sleeping alongside animals meant enduring their smells, noises, and occasional messes. The sharp tang of manure, the constant rustling of straw, and the midnight stirring of restless creatures were part of the nightly experience. Fleas and lice thrived in such close quarters, passing from animals to humans and back again, adding an itchy discomfort to the already difficult winters. Yet peasants accepted these inconveniences as the price of survival. To them, warmth was worth far more than cleanliness, and in any case, concepts of hygiene were vastly different from our modern expectations. Smoke from the hearth, while irritating to the lungs, also acted as a natural disinfectant, discouraging pests and keeping disease somewhat at bay. Practicality outweighed discomfort. The presence of animals inside the home was never questioned in terms of should we, but only in terms of how many can fit. In the harshest winters, every body counted, every breath added to the shared heat, and so peasants learned to live with the inconveniences, finding comfort in the chorus of animal sounds that filled their homes as the darkness stretched between peasants and their animals deepened through this nightly closeness. These creatures were not merely tools of labor, but companions who shared the same dangers and endured the same cold. A peasant child might fall asleep listening to the soft breathing of a cow just beyond the straw curtain, or wake in the early dawn to the gentle clucking of hens announcing the day. Over time, these animals became woven into the fabric of daily life, not only as sources of food or wool, but as fellow survivors of winter. Folklore and superstition often reflected this bond. In some regions, it was believed that animals, especially oxen and cattle, knelt at midnight on Christmas Eve, honoring the birth of Christ. In other tales, the warmth of animals was said to carry protective blessings, shielding families from frost spirits and malevolent forces lurking in the winter dark. Whether rooted in faith or necessity, these stories reflected the deep interconnection between humans and animals, a connection forged not in luxury, but in the shared fight against cold, hunger, and death. To sleep with animals was not just practical, it was symbolic, a reminder that survival in the medieval world was never a solitary endeavor, but one carried out in the company of every creature. The idea of sleeping with animals inside one's home may seem foreign, perhaps even unpleasant, but to medieval peasants, it was simply life. Their homes were not divided into neat categories of stable and bedroom, but instead blurred together into a single space where all living things found refuge against the cold. This arrangement reminds us of a world where humans lived in far closer harmony with nature than we do today, where warmth was not flicked on with a switch, but earned through cleverness, endurance, and cooperation. On those endless winter nights, when frost painted the windows and the wind howled outside, the warmth of a cow, the soft body heat of a sheep, or the loyal presence of a dog could mean everything. It is easy for us to overlook such details when imagining medieval life, but for those who lived it, this was a nightly reality, as ordinary as saying a prayer before bed. The practice of sleeping with animals stands as one of the most vivid examples of how peasants survived the coldest nights, a forgotten survival secret, as strange to us as it was ordinary to them. And in that strangeness lies a powerful truth. Survival often requires breaking the boundaries we imagine between human and animal, embracing the messy, noisy, but ultimately life-saving closeness of living together, one breath and one peasant's cottage was their fortress against the winter cold, then clothing and bedding were their armor. In an age without modern insulation or heated blankets, what one wore to bed could be the thin line between a tolerable night and a freezing, restless ordeal. Peasants did not own wardrobes bursting with options. Garments were few, often handed down, patched, and repaired until they were little more than threadbare remnants. Wool was the most common fabric, spun at home or obtained through local trade, and though coarse, it was invaluable for its ability to retain warmth even when damp. At night, peasants often slept in the same garments they wore during the day: tunics, hose, cloaks, and occasionally woolen caps. Undressing fully was uncommon, not out of prudishness, but necessity. Every scrap of clothing helped hold in precious body heat. Children, in particular, were bundled in layers, sometimes wrapped in extra woolen cloth or animal hides, to protect their small frames from the unforgiving night air. Unlike the nobility, who might own fur-lined gowns or finely woven blankets, the peasants' protection was humble, practical, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the seasons. What they lacked in luxury, they made up for in ingenuity, turning simple garments into shields against the winter's equally modest, yet surprisingly clever in design. The standard peasant bed was a straw mattress, stuffed with whatever material could be gathered: straw, hay, reeds, or rushes. While not plush, this provided insulation from the damp earth floor and offered at least some measure of comfort. Over time, the straw would flatten and grow musty, requiring regular replacement, but fresh bundles were relatively easy to collect. To add warmth, peasants layered wool blankets, fur pelts, or patched cloths over their bedding. Wealthier villagers might have sheepskins or rabbit furs, while poorer families relied on old garments stitched together. On the coldest nights, heated stones or bricks, wrapped in cloth, were tucked into the bedding, creating a pocket of warmth that lingered for hours. Families often shared one large bed or sleeping space, clustering together under a pile of blankets, with children nestled in the center for protection. In many ways, the medieval bed was less about individual comfort and more about collective survival. Each layer of straw, each woolen covering, and each shared breath beneath the blankets was another weapon in the battle against the winter nights. Was not just about physical warmth, it was also about ritual. As darkness fell, peasants turned to habits and traditions that prepared them for the long hours ahead. Before bedding down, many families recited evening prayers, invoking the protection of saints against cold, hunger, and the dangers of the night. These prayers were whispered by firelight, the flickering flames casting shadows across the low cottage walls. After prayers, families might share a final story or song, a ritual as much about comfort as distraction. Tales of saints, local legends, or even simple fables help children drift into slumber, their imaginations carrying them away from the bleakness outside. For adults, storytelling was a way to pass time during the endless winter darkness, and it reaffirmed the bonds of kinship that were essential for survival. In some regions, it was also customary to drink a warm ale, mead, or herbal infusion before bed, a small luxury that not only provided warmth, but also calmed the body for rest. These rituals, though modest, transformed the act of going to bed from mere endurance into a shared experience, one that carried echoes of faith, family, and the stubborn hope that morning bedding also reflected the broader cycles of peasant life. Garments were often homespun, woven by women of the household during long winter evenings. Wool had to be carded, spun into yarn, and then woven into cloth, a labor-intensive process that made every piece of clothing precious. Because of this, nothing was wasted. Old tunics became blankets, worn-out hose were patched again and again, and furs, when available, were treasured heirlooms passed down across generations. Bedding, too, required maintenance. Straw mattresses had to be replaced or fluffed, blankets shaken free of pests, and furs carefully guarded against damp and mold. In this way, the nightly rituals of clothing and bedding were intertwined with the rhythms of labor and domestic care. Even as peasants tried to rest, their surroundings reminded them of the countless hours of work embedded in every woolen cap or stitched blanket. Each item carried the touch of hands that had spun, woven, or sewn it, and in that sense, the very materials of warmth were living testaments to the endurance of peasant households. Survival was not accidental, but painstakingly crafted, woven thread by thread into the fabric of daily experience of bedtime in a medieval peasant cottage would have been unlike anything we know today. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, the faint rustle of dry stalks beneath you, and the smell of earth rising from the packed dirt floor. Above, a rough thatched roof let through the occasional draft, so that even beneath blankets, the night air nipped at your nose and fingertips. Around you, the muffled breathing of family members filled the room, blending with the occasional grunt of a nearby cow or the clucking of chickens roosting in the shadows. The only light came from the fading glow of the hearth, throwing red patterns across the room until it finally sank into darkness. Your tunic scratches faintly against your skin, and the coarse wool blanket itches your neck, but it is warmth, and that is what matters. Perhaps you sip one last mouthful of weak ale, say a final prayer, and then pull the blanket tighter as sleep slowly overtakes you. It was not a comfortable sleep by modern standards, but it was enough, a surrender to rest in a world where survival itself was the greatest luxury. Such moments capture the essence of medieval peasant life, raw, imperfect, but profoundly human in its ability to find comfort amid medieval clothing, bedding, and nighttime rituals reveal the creativity and resilience of peasants as they faced winter's coldest nights. With only the simplest of materials, they fashioned systems of warmth that relied on ingenuity, resourcefulness, and above all, community. A woolen tunic might be rough and plain, but it was a shield against frost. A straw mattress might be humble, but it lifted families from the damp chill of the earth. A whispered prayer or story might not warm the body, but it soothed the mind and strengthened the will to endure. Together, these small acts and objects created a nightly rhythm of survival that stretched across centuries. What strikes us most today is not their poverty or lack of comfort, but the quiet determination that allowed them to face each night with courage. Every blanket patched, every garment spun, every ritual repeated was a step in the unending dance between human fragility and nature's severity. Through their clothing, bedding, and rituals, medieval peasants transformed their humble homes into sanctuaries of survival. And as the wind howled outside and frost settled over the fields, within those smoky cottages families clung together, wrapped not just in wool and straw, but in the enduring warmth of wind swept across medieval Europe. Peasants clung not only to the physical tools of survival, but also to a wealth of traditions and strange customs that carried them through the long winters. Survival in those dark, frigid months was not just a matter of blankets and firewood. It was also about rituals, beliefs, and small comforts that gave warmth to both body and soul. One such custom was the simple act of drinking warm ale before sleep. Brewed in village cottages, often weak and cloudy by modern standards, ale was a daily staple. In the coldest months, peasants would warm it by the fire, sometimes infusing it with herbs like rosemary or sage, and sip it slowly before bed. The heat of the drink, combined with the mild alcohol, provided a fleeting sense of inner warmth, dulling the edge of winter's bite. For many, it was less about physical heat than about ritual, a way to close the day with comfort in a world where comfort was scarce. Superstition, too, found its way into the nightly routines of peasants enduring the cold. The medieval world was alive with unseen forces, spirits, and saints, and winter nights were thought to be especially haunted by restless presences. Some peasants whispered prayers to Saint Blaise, patron against the ailments of the throat, believing he would guard them against icy chills that could settle in the chest. Others hung charms of iron above doorways, convinced that malicious frost spirits, invisible but cruel, lurked in the darkness outside. The sound of howling winds was sometimes thought to be the wild hunt, a terrifying spectral procession sweeping through the night sky. To survive such nights was not only about staying warm. It was about surviving the unseen dangers peasants believed prowled beyond cold. The rhythms of medieval sleep were unlike ours today. Many historians believe that in the long winter months, peasants lived by a pattern of 2 sleeps. After sundown, families might settle down in the dim warmth of their cottages, drifting into the first sleep of the night. Hours later, perhaps around midnight, they would stir again. This was not insomnia, but a natural rhythm shaped by darkness and cold. During this watch, as it was sometimes called, peasants might tend the fire, share quiet conversation, or whisper prayers before returning to a second sleep until dawn. In this way, sleep itself became a survival tool, broken into manageable parts that allowed firewood to be stretched, embers to be tended, and the long night to feel a little less endless. Communal life was another key to enduring the cold. In the depths of winter, when work in the fields slowed, peasants often gathered together in cottages to share not just warmth, but also stories. Oral storytelling was one of the oldest survival traditions, and on nights when snow drifted high against the walls, families might sit close to the hearth as an elder spun tales of saints, of faraway kings, or of ancient heroes. These gatherings created more than entertainment. They gave a sense of belonging, a reminder that even in hunger and frost, one was part of a community. The act of listening, of imagining, of escaping into another world for an hour or two, became its own form of survival. In that dim glow, peasants learned to endure not only with their bodies, but with also circulated during the coldest nights. Some peasants believed that placing a heated stone beneath the bed could drive away chills, not only through its warmth, but because it was thought to repel spirits of illness. Herbs such as thyme and lavender were burned or tucked into bedding to keep out bad air, which was often blamed for fevers that struck in winter. In some regions, peasants even smeared animal fat on their chests or feet, believing it would trap warmth within the body. While we might smile at these methods today, for those who endured nights when the cold could creep into bones, no effort seemed too strange if it promised even the faintest comfort. Ultimately, these forgotten customs, from the warmth of ale to the comfort of charms to the breaking of sleep into two distinct parts, remind us that survival in medieval winters was as much about the mind and spirit as it was about the body. Peasants faced nights that were not just cold, but frighteningly long and uncertain, filled with real dangers of frostbite and hunger, but also haunted by fears of spirits and ill fortune. Yet through rituals, community, and belief, they found ways to endure. In the quiet hours of night, wrapped in wool and straw, surrounded by family, animals, and flickering shadows, medieval peasants leaned on their traditions to carry them through. Strange though they may seem to us today, these customs gave meaning to survival and made the difference between despair and resilience in the coldest nights of the Middle Ages. It is easy to imagine only the bite of frost or the weight of snow. But for medieval peasants, one of the hardest things to endure was not just the cold itself, but the endless, stretching darkness of winter nights. In the depths of January, the sun might vanish by mid-afternoon and not rise again until late morning. That meant peasants lived in a world where nearly 2/3 of the day was swallowed by night. Without clocks, electricity, or the glow of street lamps, the blackness was almost total once the fire burned low. Inside their cottages, the flames of a single hearth created islands of flickering light, but beyond that circle lay shadows and uncertainty. In such darkness, time slowed, and survival became as much about patience and mental resilience as about warmth. The coldest nights were endless not only in temperature, but in their silence and their ability to press heavily on the mind. To fight this oppressive darkness, peasants turned to faith as a shield against fear. Nighttime prayers were a common part of life, whispered before bed in the hope that saints or angels would guard against misfortune. Families might recite the Pater Noster, the Our Father, or offer petitions to saints thought to protect sleepers from nightmares. In some villages, a cross made of wood or rushes was hung above the bed to drive away evil spirits that were believed to wander most freely in the night. Faith provided not only spiritual comfort, but a way to explain the unexplainable. When an illness struck suddenly in winter, or when livestock froze despite every effort, peasants could tell themselves that divine will or unseen spirits were at work. Belief gave structure to fear, and in the darkness of medieval nights, structure itself could feel the unknown, often shaped the rhythm of these long nights. Outside the safety of the cottage, wolves prowled in certain regions, their howls drifting across frozen fields. Thieves, too, were a real threat, for the cover of darkness made raids on food stores or livestock easier. But even more powerful were the imagined dangers. Peasants feared the devil himself might come wandering on cold nights, seeking souls weakened by hunger and despair. Tales were told of witches flying through the night, or of ghostly hunts that swept across the sky, carrying the unlucky away. These stories were not dismissed as simple legends. They were lived realities in the minds of those who listened to the winds clawing at their shutters. To endure the night was not only to survive wolves and frost, but also to withstand the heavy weight of dread that every creak of timber and every whistle of wind could bring. The structure of sleep, too, was deeply influenced by these fears and by the cold. As we have seen, many peasants practiced segmented sleep, a first sleep and a second sleep, with hours of wakefulness in between. During this wakeful watch, families might tend the fire, mend clothing, or whisper prayers together. In some places, neighbors visited one another during these midnight hours, walking short distances through the snow by lantern light. These visits not only broke the monotony of endless nights, but also reassured peasants that they were not alone in their struggle. Imagine stepping into a neighbor's cottage in the dead of winter, the smell of smoke and broth heavy in the air, the fire glowing warmly as stories were exchanged. These small gatherings did more than pass the time. They turned fear into fellowship, and loneliness also bore the toll of the endless night. Cold seeped into the bones, and peasants often suffered from chilblains, frost-nipped fingers, or aching joints made worse by dampness. With little medicine available, peasants relied on folk remedies during the long nights. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were placed at the feet, garlic was hung to ward off illness, and sometimes even urine-soaked cloths were used to soothe frostbite, a practice that might sound shocking to us today, but was believed to draw out the chill. These remedies were paired with hope, endurance, and the simple will to push forward into the next dawn. For the peasant, Every morning was a small triumph, a victory over the darkness that sought to wear them down night after night. And so, the medieval peasant's greatest survival secret during the coldest, longest nights was not only found in straw beds, woolen cloaks, or bowls of stew. It was found in resilience, the quiet strength of enduring what seemed unendurable. Through faith, superstition, community, and ritual, they learned to outlast both the freezing air and the endless shadows. To lie in the dark, listening to the wind scrape against the thatch, and to wake again when the faint gray light of dawn returned, was itself an act of defiance. For those who lived centuries ago, survival meant more than staying alive. It meant carrying on, night after night, with the knowledge that even the longest winter must eventually yield to spring. In that truth lay the final secret of survival, the hope that no matter how endless the night felt, dawn would always come. As the long night of medieval winter fades into dawn, we step back from the frost and the fire and return to the present. The peasants we have followed may have lived centuries ago, but their story is not so distant from our own. They remind us that survival is not only about strength or wealth, but about small acts of endurance, sharing warmth, telling stories, whispering prayers, and holding fast to the belief that morning will come. The nights were long, the cold was merciless, and the fears were many, yet still they endured. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson left behind by the peasants of the Middle Ages, that even in the darkest of winters, human resilience is stronger than ice, stronger than hunger, and stronger than fear. So as you drift now into sleep, let the echoes of their quiet strength carry you. Rest in the knowledge that, just as dawn always returned for them, so too will it come for you. Good night.